So I'm currently working on a book titled Moorings, the Dhow Trade, States and Capitalism on the Indian Ocean, which really focuses on the social fabric of a mobile maritime seafaring community from Kutch in Western India. And the book examines how the contemporary dhow or wooden sailing vessel trade is embedded in long-standing Indian Ocean idioms of exchange and how these idioms kind of articulate with state sovereignty and global capital. I came to this project because I was interested in thinking about how dhows that were once, celebrated for enabling mobility and cosmopolitanism across the Indian Ocean have since 9/11 become a locus of anxieties around security. But at the same time, as we're familiar from our location in the Gulf, dhows, of course, continue to traverse old Indian Ocean routes, transporting cargoes like household goods, diesel, foodstuffs, cars, and even food aid across minor Indian Ocean ports. And the book kind of suggests that these dhows have become crucial intermediaries in global shipping today, going where container ships cannot or will not go, and then often become, sinews of war and trade, as Lale Khalili has put it. So I'm interested in kind of imagining tensions between states that are seeking to control mobility and these mobile, subaltern Muslim dhow seafarers from India specifically. Initially, I thought that the project was going to be one about sovereignty because I saw this as the kind of major point of contestation between like a nation state, vision of sovereignty as this closed thing and dhow sailors who are kind of moving across nation states with a very different kind of notion of territory as well as sovereignty. And the way I was thinking about it is that the Indian Ocean has historically had a shared and layered conception of sovereignty and what Achille Mbembe has called an itinerant territoriality. And then, of course, since the colonial period, these mobile circuits have sort of been pushed into the underbelly of the global economy as first imperial states and then nation states have sought to regulate their movement. And so, in many ways, the Dow trade then becomes illicit at some times, and then at other times becomes complicit with state forms. These contestations between sovereignty actually ultimately became a question about mobility. What are we actually thinking about mobility? And this is what I'm trying to theorize about, taking the location of the Gulf, but also thinking about the Gulf in its kind of relationship to India. So the towns that these seafarers come from are these two towns here, Mandvi and Jamsalaya. It's like a 3-day trip to Dubai from here. So it's quite close actually. And the way these sailors would describe their relationship to Dubai is that Dubai is actually an extension of Jamsalaya or Mandvi. And they actually end up spending more time in Dubai than they do at home, right? And Dubai not as a place that they settle into, but as a place of transshipment. It's a place that they dock in through the year as they move, whether it is to Somalia, to Yemen. Dubai and Sharjah are the main ports through which they operate, but it's really around transshipment. And so, one way in which I'm thinking about this kind of mobility, this movement, constant movement between India, East Africa, and the UAE, is really trying to think about a vernacular concept that captures the way the sailors themselves from the deck of a dhow are thinking about this form of mobility. And I was prompted to do that actually by reading the work of folks like Eng Sang Ho. And Eng Sang Ho has argued that the imperial view was often seen as or described as the view from the boat, but there were other boats as well, right? That the vision of nation states or imperial states is not the only one that exists, that there are other histories of interconnection that actually the Indian Ocean allows you to see. And in other work, he talks about this kind of deeply rooted state based thinking in Western social theory, from Marx to Weber to Durkheim, and really how society itself was conceptualized for the state and vice versa. So how do we move out of these kind of boxes of nation states and theorize completely differently? So one way in which I'm trying to do that is by thinking through the very basic unit of mobility for these seafarers, which is called the gauche, or actually the voyage itself. Um, And this is the Dhow port in Dera, from where many of these voyages begin and end. So the voyage for these Kutchi sailors marks time, space, as well as capital. It's the basic unit through which they think about movement. When they set off on a voyage, they just know the next place that they're going to be. After that, they have no idea where they're going. And the voyage has other significances too, because they're actually paid based on each voyage that they make. They're given a salary, but that's usually not given until the end of the sailing season, and it's very minor. So they actually rely on tips and money that they make on each voyage. And simultaneously, the voyage is also wrapped up in religious practices. So part of it is kind of looking at how the voyage itself is a way to think about the entanglement of the social, the seemingly economic, the religious, right? That these cannot be separated from each other, because as a unit, the voyage kind of brings these separate, or what we theorize as separately, actually, in Western social theory, that they all kind of come together in the voyage. But the voyage is also a place from which they think about risk and danger, because of course anything can happen at a voyage. So part of what I'm doing in my year of research here in Dubai is really thinking through connections to Iran. And this was prompted because of events that occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're all familiar in some ways with the history of the Persian Gulf and how this region is incredibly fraught in terms of thinking through Iran UAE connections. But one thing that came to fore during that time was the intimacy of that relationship. So what happened when these UAE ports were closed to Iranian dhows? Indian dhows started kind of transshipping goods to Iran, but not arriving in Iranian ports. The transshipment took place actually at sea in the Strait of Hormuz. There was this one dhow that, I've known one of the sailors who was on that dhow for about 9 years, starting in Mombasa, and he's been like a key interlocutor in my research. So what happened was they were transporting consumer goods, medicines, cigarettes, TVs, fridges, all kinds of things to Iran during those lockdowns. And the way they did it was they moved from the port of Dubai to in the Strait of Hormuz. They were given a location in the Gulf of Oman, so not in Iranian territorial waters, but outside of Iranian territorial waters, where they were offloading these goods onto Iranian fishing boats that would ultimately carry those goods to Iran. But they were intercepted by the Iranian Coast Guard. So Yusuf, as I'm calling him, was then arrested, as was the rest of the crew, and they were detained in Iran for over 15 months. His voyage was completely interrupted, right? Like this was not the plan. But sailors are often used to getting stuck, as I found. Like the Indian embassy in Bandar Abbas actually even has a helpline for Indian seafarers who get stuck in Iranian territorial waters because of some mishap at sea or then on smuggling charges. And the person I spoke to in Bandar Abbas explained to me that the cases of arrest on charges of smuggling have increased exponentially in recent years. So in the case of, thinking through how does somebody like a sailor who's supposed to be this very mobile figure, right? Like crisscrossing the Indian Ocean, going on these voyages. But the voyage is only made possible on the basis of him being stuck on land. This is a real possibility. And this is one that actually, it's a risk that they have to take to be able to move these goods. So part of what I'm struggling with now is thinking about the UAE as a kind of space that makes this kind of mobility possible on the one hand, right? Like this movement towards Iran, but at the same time produces a feeling of stuckness and stasis. Central to the Dhow trade is, of course, arbitrage. What they're doing is moving goods that can be found, cheaply in one place to a place where they're more expensive and have more value. And typically, social scientists have thought about arbitrage as a financial concept. And typically, in financial theory, arbitrage is thought of as risk-free, that it's this very easy way to kind of move currency or move money and derive profits from simple movement. So what I'm trying to think through in this part of the project, which is just one chapter, is really how actually arbitrage is predicated on risking the laboring body of the sailor, who at the same time is completely kind of embedded in and invested in making movement possible, but always knows that his movement can be stopped at any time, right? Whether it's the police, whether it's danger at sea, right? That there's always a risk of being stuck. So, for instance, in the case of Yusuf, who was arrested in Iran, the merchant, the dhow owner, the shipping agent, who were all part of that transaction, right? Their bodies were not at stake. Like they weren't arrested in Iran. It was the sailors who were laboring on board the vessel who were arrested and who were actually stuck in jail. How do you think then of mobility, not just as this romantic notion or as like free movement in the Indian Ocean, but actually think through the ways in which different states come to regulate movement and how these sailors navigate different regulatory authorities? So that's something that I'm grappling with because in the Gulf, there is this narrative, right? Of like Dubai as a free port that enables all of these different kinds of movement. And in many ways, I mean, the way the Dubai port works is historically a very Indian Ocean form. Like the idea of low taxes on trade that comes from classic old Indian Ocean models. This is how historically port cities that became very crucial historically actually function was through lower taxes on trade, a kind of welcoming attitude towards foreigners, right? And this is kind of fashioned in the way Dubai and Sharjah and the UAE more generally imagine themselves. But at the same time, it has this other underbelly in terms of restricting movement to certain places, but at the same time having these kinds of shadowy deals. So, one way in which people in Iran have been able to deal with sanctions is actually through moving currency in the UAE. Oftentimes, like the Iranian merchant I worked with, for instance, he lived between Keshem and Sharjah and had bank accounts in both. And the value of currency actually changes every day. So the bail amount that was levied on each sailor who was on board that dhow was about 8,000 US dollars per person, which is extremely high. But on every day, because the value of the Iranian rial would keep changing, that value would keep changing as well. So it was this kind of crazy negotiation of what is the actual amount that needs to be paid and how do you send that money to them. And ultimately, the Iranian Emirati merchant, he was the one who actually did the financial transaction after much persuasion. But again, it's like mobility isn't this free thing anymore, right? And thinking about currencies, even not just people and goods, but there's a constant kind of getting stuck. There's a moment of being stuck. But at the same time, it's a circular thing. So Yusuf this isn't the first time he was in jail. This is maybe the second or the third time that he's been in jail. And he will continue to kind of go on a voyage and continue to kind of engage in these transactions. His getting stuck also enables a continuation of transactions. Like the Indian embassy in Bandar Abbas is fully aware that this trade is taking place and they can't do anything to stop it. Iranian authorities also know what's happening. They're often very much involved in the process. In fact, people told me that one of the reasons they were caught is because they probably didn't pay off the right authorities in Iran, or that they were late in paying someone off in Iran. So there is an investment in enabling this form of mobility, but at the same time, it can easily be undercut. So how do you think of these tensions together? And this is in some ways new work for me, but in focusing on the Ghosh or on the voyage or telling the story through these kinds of intimate movements, I'm hoping to theorize up about what mobility actually means. So currently, I'm interested in thinking about arbitrage, really, and this form of movement and these forms of exchanges as something that enable mobility and enable this creation of trans regionality, actually, in the Indian Ocean, but in fact, how it's historically produced, that is deeply rooted in the history of the Indian Ocean and this kind of dance between mobility and stasis. How do we think about movement alongside the dilemma that a sailor like Yusuf found himself in, which is actually getting stuck? This was just one kind of anecdote from one chapter. But the book then moves through different locations and different moorings. It's quite dizzying in terms of thinking about like area studies because it's not one area. Like I've been, thinking through Middle Eastern studies, but also South Asian studies, African studies. So how do you think of all of these locations not as separate sites, but actually together? And again, the only solution in my head is to think about the basic unit of movement, which is the voyage, because that's the thing that connects them all. But then I do have questions around whether that unit of movement is actually something that is extensible as we're trying to think up from theory. And I mean, my investment in it really is to take a vernacular concept, one that is a lived experience of the people that I'm working with, and think through that as a form, as opposed to coming from social theory and then imposing something onto this context, which does not work, in my opinion. What is at stake in thinking through a vernacular concept as opposed to one that comes from social theory? Thinking through the context itself. So that's one question that I'm definitely interested in, and the extensibility of it. It may not work in other contexts, but does it need to? Does this need to be a universal story? Or can we take, movement and the particularities of the context as a place to think about a specific problem or a specific context? How extensible does this actually need to be?